I walked into Thanksgiving dinner carrying keys to 3 Beverly Hills properties I'd just acquired, wearing the same thrift store dress I'd worn for 2 years while building my empire. But when I sat down, my cousin Jessica announced to the entire family, "Look at Maya, still dressing like she's homeless. When are you getting a real job instead of this property flipping fantasy?" 3 days later, real estate mogul Richard Blackstone shook my hand and told his stunned conference room, "Gentlemen, meet Maya. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." Chen, she owns half of Beverly Hills. My name is Maya Chen, and if you've ever been judged by your appearance while secretly building an empire, this story is for you. Growing up in Monterey Park, I was surrounded by family expectations that revolved around traditional success, stable jobs, prestigious degrees, and maintaining appearances that showed everyone you were making it in America. My father, David Chen, managed a successful accounting practice in downtown Los Angeles. My mother, Linda, worked as a bank manager and believed that financial security came from steady paychecks and conservative investments. They had built a comfortable middle-class life in the San Gabriel Valley, complete with a pristine house that was always ready for unexpected guests and family gatherings, where success was measured by your job title and salary. But it was my grandfather, Henry Hank Chen, who understood the power of ownership. Every Sunday, while other kids watched cartoons or played video games, I spent my time walking through different neighborhoods with him, listening to his stories about buying his first property in 1962 with a $500 down payment. Grandpa Hank had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing and built a small portfolio of rental properties that eventually put all 5 of his children through college. "Maya," he'd say, pointing to a rundown duplex we'd stopped to examine, "rich people don't work for money, they make money work for them." Every building has a story, and every story has profit if you know how to read it. He handed me a small leather notebook that he'd used to track his first property deals, filled with his careful handwriting documenting purchase prices, renovation costs, and rental income. That notebook became my Bible. While my cousins dreamed of corner offices and corporate careers, I dreamed of property deeds and rental income. I threw myself into learning everything about real estate: economics courses, finance classes, construction basics, and property law. I studied market trends until I could predict neighborhood gentrification patterns and identify undervalued properties before they hit the market. When I told my family I wanted to skip graduate school and start investing in real estate, the reaction was immediate and unanimous. "Maya," my mother said, looking genuinely concerned, "real estate is too risky. You need a stable career first. You could be a doctor, a lawyer, work at a bank. Build security before you start gambling with property." Dad was more direct. "Maya, you're talking about throwing away your education for some fantasy about getting rich quick. What about health insurance? What about retirement? Property investment is for people who already have money." But Grandpa Hank believed in me. He spent hours teaching me how to analyze property values, calculate cash flow, and identify neighborhoods on the verge of transformation. When I found my first potential investment, a small duplex in Echo Park, he co-signed the loan and helped me with the down payment. "This is how wealth is built," he said as we walked through the property. "Not by working harder, but by working smarter." My family's reaction was predictable. They attended the closing, but every conversation included warnings about the risks I was taking and suggestions about when I would get serious about finding a real career. At that first property, I found my calling. The renovation, the tenant management, the steady cash flow, it all made sense. I was building something that would generate income whether I was working or sleeping. My first real breakthrough came 18 months after buying the Echo Park duplex, when I discovered something that would change my entire approach to real estate investing. While researching comparable properties in the area, I noticed a pattern that every other investor seemed to be missing. Neighborhoods were gentrifying in predictable waves, following specific infrastructure improvements. The key insight came during a late-night session analyzing city planning documents that most investors never bothered to read. I discovered that the city had approved a new Metro line extension that would connect Echo Park directly to downtown LA, with construction starting in 2 years. Property values would explode once the announcement went public. I spent 3 weeks walking every street in a 6-block radius. identifying undervalued properties that would benefit most from the transportation upgrade. While other investors were chasing obvious deals in trendy neighborhoods, I was quietly building a portfolio in an area that was about to transform. My strategy was simple but revolutionary. Buy properties that looked terrible but had perfect bones, renovate them efficiently, and either rent them for cash flow or sell them for massive profits once the neighborhood caught up to my vision. I developed a systematic approach to property evaluation that could predict gentrification patterns 6 months to 2 years before they became obvious to mainstream investors. The Echo Park duplex became my testing ground. I renovated it for $15,000, increased the rent by 60%, and saw the property value double within 8 months. But more importantly, I had developed a replicable system for identifying emerging neighborhoods before anyone else recognized their potential. Within 6 months, I had acquired 3 more properties in Echo Park using the same strategy. Each purchase was financed using the equity from my previous acquisitions, creating a snowball effect that accelerated my portfolio growth. By year 2, I owned 7 properties and was generating $8,000 per month in passive rental income. But the real validation came when I predicted the next wave of gentrification in Highland Park. Using my infrastructure analysis method, I identified that a major grocery chain was planning to open a flagship store in the area, which would trigger rapid neighborhood improvement. I bought 4 properties in Highland Park before the grocery store announcement went public. When the store opened 6 months later, property values in the area increased by 40% overnight. Local real estate agents began calling me, asking how I'd known to invest in Highland Park before it became the hottest neighborhood in LA. My reputation as someone who could identify emerging markets began spreading through the investor community. The success in Highland Park led to opportunities I never expected. Property wholesalers started bringing me deals before they hit the market. Real estate agents began partnering with me to identify properties with the highest investment potential. I was invited to speak at investor meetups about my neighborhood analysis techniques. But the breakthrough that changed everything came when I developed a financing strategy that eliminated the need for traditional bank loans. By partnering with private investors who provided capital in exchange for a share of profits, I could acquire properties faster than anyone relying on conventional financing. This private lending approach allowed me to close deals in days rather than weeks, giving me a massive advantage in competitive markets. Within 18 months, I had raised $2.3 million in private capital and was acquiring properties at a rate that shocked even experienced investors. My family watched these developments with a mixture of confusion and skepticism. They saw me driving a 10-year-old Honda, wearing thrift store clothes, and living in a modest apartment. What they didn't understand was that every dollar I earned was being reinvested into acquiring more properties. I was building wealth, not displaying it. But to them, I looked like someone who was struggling, not someone who was systematically building a real estate empire that would eventually make me one of the largest property owners in Los Angeles. The betrayal came from someone I had trusted completely. Marcus Rivera had been my mentor in the LA real estate investment community. The one experienced investor who seemed genuinely committed to helping newer investors succeed. He was everything I aspired to become: sophisticated, connected, and apparently dedicated to sharing knowledge that could help others build wealth through property investment. It started when Marcus approached me about a joint venture opportunity in West Hollywood. This was prime territory in 2020, and properties in the area were commanding premium prices that individual investors could rarely afford. Marcus told me this was my chance to break into high-end markets, to create something that would establish me as a serious player in luxury real estate. For 4 months, I worked obsessively on the deal. I analyzed market comparables, researched zoning regulations, and developed a comprehensive renovation strategy for a 6-unit apartment building that could be converted into luxury condominiums. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I identified permits we'd need, contractors who could execute the work, and a marketing plan that would position the units to sell for $800,000 each. The breakthrough came when I discovered a legal loophole that would allow us to add 2 additional units to the building without triggering expensive environmental reviews. Using my research skills and knowledge of city regulations, I found that the property had been incorrectly classified, and we could legally increase the unit count by 33%. This would add nearly $1.6 million in potential profit to the project. Marcus reviewed my analysis with obvious excitement. "Maya, this is brilliant," he said, studying my development plans spread across his conference room table. "This kind of regulatory insight is what separates successful developers from small-time flippers. I want to present this opportunity to my investor group myself." I was thrilled. Finally, someone would champion my work in front of serious real estate money. 3 weeks later, I was reviewing property listings when my friend Lisa Martinez, a real estate attorney, called me with a troubled voice. "Maya, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like hearing it," she said quietly. "Marcus just presented a West Hollywood development opportunity to the Westside Investment Group." My heart started racing. "That's great! How did the presentation go?" Lisa's voice was grim. "He presented your entire development strategy as his own discovery, called it the Rivera method. Your name wasn't mentioned once, and your regulatory analysis was credited to his, quote, years of experience with city planning departments." The world seemed to shift beneath me. 4 months of my most innovative research, stolen and presented as someone else's expertise. I drove straight to Marcus's office and walked in without an appointment. "Marcus, I need to discuss the Westside Investment Group presentation." He looked up from his computer with complete composure. "Ah, Maya, great work on the research support for that project. Your due diligence was very thorough." "Research support? Marcus, that was my entire development strategy, my analysis, my regulatory discovery, my financial projections." His expression remained unchanged. "Maya, you need to understand how real estate partnerships work. Junior investors contribute research to senior developers' projects. That's how deals get financed and executed. I refined your ideas, added market context, and presented them to investors who actually have the capital to make projects happen." "You stole my deal." Marcus's tone hardened. "I mentored you through a complex analysis and gave you invaluable development experience. That opportunity wouldn't exist without my relationships and credibility. Besides, who do you think investors would rather partner with? Someone with 2 years of experience or someone with 20 years of proven development success?" I stood there speechless, realizing my mentor had been grooming me not for partnership, but for exploitation. "I suggest you focus on building your portfolio and remember that collaboration, not ego, builds real estate careers." That night, I called Grandpa Hank, desperate for support, someone to validate my anger. Instead, he sighed heavily. "Maya, this is exactly why I worried about partnering with established players. In real estate, your ideas are only as protected as your ability to execute them independently." The Marcus incident wasn't an isolated betrayal. It was the beginning of a systematic pattern that made me question everything I thought I understood about the real estate investment community. Over the next 2 years, I watched the same cycle repeat itself with devastating consistency across different deals and partnerships. It started with smaller thefts. My market analysis reports would disappear from shared investor databases, only to reappear as collaborative research credited to senior developers. My innovative financing strategies were implemented on major projects, but attributed to, quote, industry best practices, rather than their actual creator. When I raised concerns, I was reminded that knowledge sharing was essential for market growth. Then came Daniel Stone, fresh from a prestigious MBA program with a trust fund, and a father who happened to own a major construction company. Stone was introduced to our investor network as my supposed peer, but within weeks, it became clear he was being positioned for high-profile opportunities I'd been working toward for years. The most blatant example occurred during the Beverly Hills opportunity that would have changed my entire trajectory. I had spent 6 months analyzing an undervalued commercial property on Wilshire Boulevard, researching zoning variances, and developing a mixed-use conversion strategy that would transform a dated office building into luxury retail and residential spaces. The project was extraordinarily complex, requiring navigation of historical preservation requirements, luxury market positioning, and coordination with multiple city departments. I created detailed financial models showing how the property could generate $15 million in profit over 3 years through strategic phase development. My breakthrough insight was recognizing that the building's Art Deco facade qualified for historical tax credits that would offset 40% of renovation costs, a detail that every other investor had missed. This discovery made the entire project financially viable and positioned it as a prestigious development opportunity. But when it came time to present the opportunity to the Beverly Hills Investment Council, the network's senior partners chose Stone to lead the presentation. "Daniel has excellent connections in the luxury market," they explained when I questioned the decision. "This requires sophisticated high-net-worth relationship management." I watched from the back of the conference room as Stone presented my work to the most influential real estate investors in Los Angeles. He stumbled through concepts he barely understood, mispronounced architectural terms, and couldn't answer detailed questions about the tax credit calculations I developed. Yet when the presentation ended, he was praised for his, quote, innovative approach to luxury development. The following week, Stone was selected to lead the $12 million project that I had discovered and developed. But the pattern extended beyond Stone. I began documenting how opportunities were distributed throughout the entire investment community. Male investors with mediocre track records were selected for premium deals. Women with exceptional analysis skills were consistently assigned to research roles that never led to actual equity participation. Sarah Kim had developed a revolutionary approach to multifamily property valuation that increased investment returns by 25%. The method was adopted network-wide under senior partner Thompson's name. Maria Rodriguez created a tenant retention system that reduced vacancy rates by 35%. It became known as the Harrison Protocol after her male business partner. I started protecting my work obsessively. I kept encrypted copies of my original analyses, time-stamped my research submissions, and began registering my methodologies with intellectual property attorneys. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being strategic. The breaking point came when I was excluded from a major acquisition opportunity for the third time. My deal analysis was outstanding, my track record was impeccable, and my financial projections were consistently accurate. Yet I watched investors with half my experience and none of my analytical skills receive funding for projects I had identified. During my review meeting, Marcus delivered the news with clinical detachment. "Maya, you're a talented analyst, but investors are concerned about your collaborative approach. Your recent tendency to assert ownership over research creates concerns about partnership compatibility." I realized my competence had become a liability. Every innovation I created, every deal I analyzed, every profitable insight I developed was being used as evidence against me. I was too effective at finding opportunities, and that made other people uncomfortable. That night, I made a decision that would fundamentally change my career trajectory. I would stop feeding the system that was consuming my work. Instead, I would begin building wealth independently, using strategies that couldn't be stolen or appropriated by people who saw my success as their opportunity. The call came at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday in September, jarring me awake in the small apartment I'd been living in for 3 years while reinvesting every dollar into properties. The voice belonged to my mother, but it carried a tremor I'd never heard before. "Maya, you need to come to the hospital immediately. Grandpa Hank had a heart attack during his morning walk. The doctors aren't sure if he's going to make it." I drove to Cedars-Sinai, still wearing my property inspection clothes, clutching the leather notebook he'd given me 15 years earlier. By the time I reached the cardiac unit, Grandpa Hank was stable but weak, connected to monitors that tracked every heartbeat with electronic precision. I sat beside his bed for 3 days, holding his weathered hands and telling him about my investments, about the portfolio I'd built, about the battles I was fighting that had nothing to do with property appreciation or rental income. On the third evening, his eyes focused with sudden clarity. He couldn't speak well due to the oxygen mask, but he pointed to the nightstand drawer and mouthed, quote, "Important." Inside was a thick manila envelope with my name written in his careful handwriting, along with something that made my breath catch, his original property deed from 1962 and a faded photograph of him standing in front of his first rental house. But it was the letter that would change everything about my approach to real estate. "My dearest Maya," it began, dated just 6 weeks earlier. "If you're reading this, then I'm probably negotiating lease terms with whoever manages properties in the next life. I've been following your career more closely than you know, and I need you to understand something that no one else has had the courage to tell you. You're not just a good investor, you're a visionary one. I've been making calls using connections from my 50 years in Los Angeles real estate, asking questions about your work. Do you know that your neighborhood analysis methods are being copied by investment firms across the city? That your financing strategies have been adopted by developers who won't admit where they learned them? That property managers throughout LA are using your tenant retention techniques? You've been creating value that others are claiming as their own innovation. But I also know about Marcus, about Stone, about all the ways they've tried to diminish your contributions. I've seen this before, granddaughter. During my time, they did it to Asian investors, to anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of who belonged in high-end real estate. Don't let them convince you that their limitations define your potential. You have something they fear, the ability to see opportunities they can't recognize, and the analytical skills to execute deals they can't understand. Protect that gift. Document everything. Build your own network. And when the moment comes, and you'll know when it arrives, don't wait for permission to dominate this market. The letter ended with an address in Beverly Hills, written in his precise script. I recognized the format immediately. Our old property hunting expeditions from childhood. I drove to the address and discovered it led to a storage facility in a nondescript building. Inside that storage unit was a filing cabinet containing 40 years of Grandpa Hank's property records, contact lists, and correspondence with developers, city officials, and investment partners. He'd been quietly documenting the real estate industry's power structure, building profiles of key players, and tracking property ownership patterns across Los Angeles. At the bottom of the cabinet was a folder labeled Maya's Empire. Inside were property listings for 12 Beverly Hills buildings currently for sale, complete financial analysis of each opportunity, and a letter of credit from a private lender I'd never heard of, approved for $25 million in acquisition financing. Grandpa Hank died peacefully the next morning, just as the sun was rising over the Hollywood Hills. At his funeral, real estate professionals I'd never met approached me with stories about his pride in my work and comments about my exceptional market insights. I realized he'd been building a foundation for my success while I'd been fighting for recognition in rooms that were never intended to include me. Standing at his graveside, I made a decision that would define the rest of my career. I would stop trying to earn respect from people who were determined to undervalue me. Instead, I would build an empire so undeniable that they would have no choice but to acknowledge what I'd accomplished. The moment that changed everything happened 2 weeks after Grandpa Hank's funeral. During our family's traditional Thanksgiving gathering at my parents' house in Monterey Park. I had just closed on 3 Beverly Hills properties using the financing connections he'd left me, bringing my total portfolio to 47 units across Los Angeles. I also carried the keys to a commercial building on Rodeo Drive that I'd acquired that morning, a deal that would have been impossible without his network. I walked into the dining room wearing the same thrift store dress I'd worn for 2 years, carrying a folder containing property deeds worth $18 million, and the business cards of developers who were now returning my calls. The house was filled with 3 generations of extended family, all gathered around our traditional feast that had been a cornerstone of our family traditions for decades. The conversation buzzed with updates about Cousin Jennifer's promotion at the bank, Uncle Robert's successful accounting practice, and my brother's new position at a tech startup. Everyone was dressed in their best clothes, discussing salaries, job benefits, and career advancement with the pride that comes from traditional professional success. When I entered the room, the chatter gradually died as people noticed my unchanged appearance. I looked exactly the same as I had 5 years earlier. Same modest clothing, same old purse, same practical shoes that could handle property inspections. My cousin Jessica, who worked in corporate marketing and had always been the family's measuring stick for success, looked me up and down with obvious disapproval. "Look at Maya," she announced to the entire table, her voice carrying that mixture of pity and condescension I'd heard my entire life. "Still dressing like she's homeless. When are you going to get a real job and stop this property flipping fantasy? You're 32 years old, Maya. It's time to be practical." The room fell silent. I could feel every eye on me, see the sympathetic nods from relatives who agreed with her assessment. But something inside me shifted, not into anger, but into absolute clarity. Actually, Jessica, I need to share something with all of you. I pulled out my phone and opened the portfolio app that tracked my real estate holdings. This morning I closed on a commercial property on Rodeo Drive. Apparently, Beverly Hills investors are interested in working with someone who can identify undervalued assets in premium markets. The room went dead quiet. I could see my father's confused expression, my mother's dawning realization that she didn't understand what I actually did for a living. But I wasn't finished. I opened my laptop and pulled up the presentation I'd been preparing for my new investment partners. Since we're all here, let me show you what property flipping fantasy actually means. For the next 20 minutes, I walked them through my real estate empire. The 47 rental units generating $85,000 monthly in passive income. The commercial properties appreciating at 15% annually. The development projects that were reshaping entire neighborhoods. I showed them screenshots of bank statements, property appraisals, and partnership agreements with developers whose names they recognized from billboards around the city. I displayed my net worth calculation, my projected income for the next 5 years, and the equity positions I held in some of the most valuable real estate in Los Angeles. When I finished, my Uncle Paul, who had always been the family's most financially successful member, broke the silence. Maya, are you telling us you're some kind of real estate mogul, that you actually own all these properties? I looked directly at Jessica. I own more real estate than everyone in this room combined. I dress like this because every dollar I earn goes into acquiring more assets. While you've been buying clothes to impress people at work, I've been buying buildings. The room remained silent as I packed up my laptop. So you're right about one thing, Jessica. I'm not practical. Practical people work for money. I make money work for me. I looked around the table one final time. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. I hope you understand now that success isn't always visible from the outside. 3 days later, my phone rang with a call that would validate everything I'd built. Maya Chen. This is Richard Blackstone from Platinum Realty Group. We've been watching your acquisition pattern in Beverly Hills, and we'd like to discuss a partnership opportunity that could reshape the luxury real estate market. Can you meet us tomorrow at our Century City office? The call should have been the ultimate validation of my investment strategy. Instead, it became the beginning of the most challenging period of my real estate career. Because operating at the highest levels of luxury property investment comes with powerful enemies who want to see you fail. The moment news of my Beverly Hills acquisitions reached the established real estate community, the retaliation began swift and systematic. Marcus Rivera, who had spent years dismissing my capabilities, suddenly became very interested in my business activities. Maya, I've been hearing interesting things about your recent property acquisitions, he said when he called me the day after the Blackstone meeting. 47 units and commercial properties? This level of rapid expansion raises serious questions about your financing sources and market manipulation. Marcus, my acquisitions are fully documented and legally structured through traditional lending and private investment partnerships. Private investment partnerships that nobody in our network has heard of, he said, his tone growing cold. I've been making calls, Maya. Your rapid ascension in Beverly Hills is creating concerns about market stability and investor transparency. I realized he was building a case to undermine my credibility. Every unconventional financing strategy I'd used, every private lender relationship I'd developed, every acquisition that bypassed traditional real estate networks, it was all being reframed as evidence of suspicious business practices. Over the next month, my life became a gauntlet of professional sabotage. Marcus began spreading rumors about my undisclosed financial backing and aggressive acquisition tactics. Other investors who had previously been neutral started questioning my methods and suggesting I was operating outside industry standards. The most devastating blow came when Daniel Stone, leveraging his father's construction company connections, began interfering with my development projects. Contractors I'd worked with for years suddenly became unavailable. Permit approvals that should have been routine started facing mysterious delays. Suppliers who had previously offered competitive pricing began claiming they were at capacity for my projects. I spent sleepless nights managing crisis after crisis while trying to complete renovations and maintain cash flow. But the real challenge wasn't the operational setbacks. It was the isolation. Investors who had previously been collegial became distant. Industry events where I'd once been welcomed now felt hostile. I was being systematically excluded from the networks that make large-scale real estate possible. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sarah Kim, the investor whose valuation methods had been stolen and credited to senior partners, approached me at a coffee shop in West Hollywood. "Maya, I know what they're doing to you," she said quietly. "The same thing they did to me, just not as publicly. But I want you to know, there are others of us watching. Women investors who've had our deals stolen, our methods appropriated, our financing sources questioned." She handed me a secure phone with encrypted contacts. "These are investors across the city who've experienced similar treatment. We've been documenting patterns, sharing resources, building our own financing network." That phone contained contact information for 23 women real estate professionals across different specialties. All of them had experienced systematic undermining of their business development. All of them had been fighting the same battles I was fighting, individually and in silence. For the first time since the Blackstone call, I didn't feel alone. "Sarah, what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time we stopped competing for acceptance from people who are determined to exclude us. You're operating at a level none of us have ever reached. If you succeed, if you prove that competence and capital matter more than old boy networks, it changes everything for all of us. And if I fail, then we'll still be here, ready to support the next woman who breaks through." I looked at those 23 names and realized I wasn't just building a real estate portfolio. I was carrying the hopes of every woman investor who'd been told she wasn't sophisticated enough, connected enough, or credible enough for high-end real estate development. Kamal Frev. The Platinum Realty Group conference room felt like the center of the Los Angeles real estate universe as I sat across from Richard Blackstone and his team of senior partners. These were the power brokers who controlled luxury property development across Beverly Hills, Century City, and Bel Air, men whose decisions influenced property values throughout the entire region. Daniel Stone sat 2 seats away from me, nervously adjusting his tie and reviewing notes about projects he'd never actually managed. But I was no longer concerned about his presence threatening my position. I had something more powerful than his family connections. I had a track record that spoke for itself. The presentation began with Blackstone asking a simple question. "Maya, we've been tracking your acquisition pattern, and frankly, we're impressed. How did you identify the Beverly Hills opportunities that every other investor missed?" For the next hour, I dismantled conventional wisdom about luxury real estate investment. I explained how traditional market analysis focused on surface-level indicators while missing fundamental value drivers. I demonstrated how my research methodology had successfully predicted neighborhood transformation patterns 18 months before they became obvious to mainstream investors. But the moment that changed everything came when Blackstone pulled up aerial photographs of Beverly Hills and asked me to identify future acquisition targets based on my analysis framework. I walked to the presentation screen and pointed to 3 properties that appeared unremarkable to traditional investors. "This building is undervalued by 40% because the current owners don't understand the zoning variance potential. This commercial space will triple in value when the metro expansion is announced next year. And this residential property sits on a lot that can legally accommodate twice the current square footage." The room went completely silent as I outlined specific strategies for each property, including financing structures, renovation timelines, and projected returns that exceeded anything they'd seen from conventional developments. Blackstone leaned forward. "Maya, you're describing opportunities worth approximately $60 million in development potential. How confident are you in these projections?" "Confident enough to partner with you on all 3 acquisitions," I replied. "I'll provide the analysis, you provide the capital, and we'll split the profits based on actual performance." By the end of the meeting, I had secured partnership agreements for $47 million in joint development projects. More importantly, I had gained access to private capital networks that operated at levels I'd never imagined possible. The validation came immediately. Within 3 months, my Beverly Hills predictions proved accurate down to the percentage point. The zoning variance was approved, the metro expansion was announced, and the residential development potential was confirmed by city planning officials. But the real breakthrough was systematic. Blackstone began referring high-net-worth clients to me for investment consultation. Other luxury developers started requesting my market analysis before making major acquisitions. Most importantly, the financing networks that had previously been closed to me suddenly became accessible. The network of women investors that Sarah had connected me with began receiving opportunities through my new partnerships. For the first time in LA real estate history, investment decisions were being made based on analytical capability rather than social connections. 6 months later, when the Los Angeles Business Journal published their annual list of the city's most influential real estate investors, my name appeared in the top 10. The article called me the analyst who revolutionized luxury property investment. The most satisfying moment came when Marcus Rivera requested a meeting to discuss collaboration opportunities. He wanted access to my market insights and development projects, the same work he'd previously dismissed as junior-level research. I politely declined but offered to recommend some of the women investors from my network who were seeking partnership opportunities with experienced developers. The girl who had been called homeless for wearing thrift store clothes while building her empire was now setting the standard for how sophisticated investors approached luxury real estate markets. But more importantly, I had proven that competence and capital matter more than connections and credentials, opening doors for every investor who had been told they didn't belong in high-end real estate. The call came 10 months after my partnership with Platinum Realty Group had transformed me into one of Los Angeles's most sought-after real estate investors. The voice on the other end was familiar but carried a humility I'd never heard before. It was my father. "Maya, your mother and I have been talking about what happened at Thanksgiving dinner, about everything we said. We think we owe you more than an apology." His voice broke slightly. "We'd like to take you to dinner, somewhere nice. There are things we need to understand about what you've accomplished, about who you've become." 3 days later, I met them at Spago in Beverly Hills, a restaurant that symbolized the luxury market I now operated in daily. Dad looked smaller than I remembered, less certain of himself. Mom walked beside him, carrying a folder against her chest like a shield. But it was what Dad wore that surprised me most. An expensive suit I'd never seen before, as if he'd finally understood that our meeting required his best effort. We were seated at a table overlooking the city, the same skyline where my properties now dotted the landscape like pins on a map. Dad looked around at the affluent clientele, the refined atmosphere, the understated luxury that I now navigated as naturally as breathing. "Maya," he began, his voice unsteady, "I owe you an apology that should have come years ago." Mom opened her folder and pulled out printed articles, business magazine features, and real estate industry publications. "After Thanksgiving dinner, we realized we had no idea what you actually do," she said quietly. "So we started researching. We talked to people in real estate. We learned about your partnerships." Dad picked up a copy of the Los Angeles Business Journal with my photograph on the cover. "I learned that you're not just a property investor, Maya. You're considered one of the most innovative real estate analysts in the city. That your methods are being studied by major development firms. I also learned something else," he continued, meeting my eyes for the first time in years. "I learned that your net worth is significantly higher than anything I ever achieved in 40 years of accounting practice." Despite everything, I almost smiled. Of course, Dad would finally understand success in financial terms. "But that's not why I'm here apologizing," he said quickly. "I'm here because I finally understand what I was too stubborn to see. You weren't failing to be practical. You were building something I was too conventional to comprehend." Mom leaned forward. "Maya, we attended a real estate investment seminar last month. They had a guest speaker who talked about women in luxury property development. She specifically mentioned your Beverly Hills projects, called you the future of sophisticated real estate investment. We sat there realizing our daughter was the person she was praising, and we'd spent years making you feel ashamed of your choices." The conversation that followed was the most honest we'd ever had. Dad admitted that his criticism of my lifestyle had been rooted in fear. Fear that he couldn't understand my world, fear that I was taking risks he could never comprehend, and fear that my unconventional path highlighted the limitations of his traditional thinking. "I spent so many years trying to convince you to choose security over opportunity," he said. "I never considered that maybe your definition of security was building assets instead of earning paychecks." Mom pulled out one final document from her folder, an invitation addressed to our family. "This came to our house last week," she said. "It's from the Beverly Hills Chamber of Commerce, inviting us to a ceremony where you're receiving some kind of investor achievement award." I looked at the invitation. I hadn't told them about the ceremony because I'd assumed they wouldn't understand its significance. "We'd like to attend," Dad said, "if you'll have us. And Maya. I want to learn about what you do, not because I finally approve, but because I want to understand the daughter I should have trusted all along." For the first time in my life, when Dad introduced me to the restaurant staff and other diners, it wasn't with embarrassment or confusion. It was with the kind of pride that comes from finally recognizing achievement, even when it appears in forms you never expected to understand. 1 year later, I stood in the penthouse conference room of the building I just purchased on Wilshire Boulevard, looking out at a real estate empire that would have been unimaginable when I was buying my first duplex in Echo Park. The occasion was the launch of the Chen Investment Group, my new fund dedicated to developing the next generation of women real estate investors. In the front row sat my parents, both wearing their finest clothes and beaming with a pride that had taken years to develop. Next to them was Sarah Kim, now my chief investment officer and one of the most respected analysts in luxury real estate. Behind them were dozens of women investors whose careers had flourished under the mentorship and financing programs we'd established together. But it was the young woman in the third row who captured my attention most completely. Isabella Santos, a recent USC graduate with a finance degree and dreams of property development, held a small notebook and absorbed every word with the same intensity I'd shown 15 years earlier. She reminded me of myself at that age, brilliant, determined, and completely unaware of the obstacles she'd face simply because she was a woman in a male-dominated industry. 2 years ago, I began my address to the assembled investors. I sat at a family dinner table and was told I looked homeless, that I was wasting my life on property investment fantasies. Not because I had failed, but because the people who loved me most couldn't understand that building wealth sometimes requires sacrificing appearance for substance. I paused, scanning the faces before me. Today, I want to talk about what happens when you refuse to let other people's limited vision define your potential. I told them about Grandpa Hank's leather notebook, which now sat in a place of honor in my office next to photographs of me, with city officials, development partners, and the keys to properties worth over $200 million. I spoke about the network of women investors who had supported each other through systematic exclusion and professional sabotage. I explained how documenting our successes and building independent financing had created opportunities the traditional system would never have provided. But the real victory, I continued, isn't my net worth of $47 million or my partnerships with the most prestigious development firms in Los Angeles, or even the Urban Land Institute award I received last month for innovative investment strategies. I looked directly at Isabella Santos. The real victory is that tomorrow a young woman will enter the real estate industry in a city where her analytical skills won't be dismissed, where her innovative thinking will be valued, and where her path to building wealth won't require her to fight the same battles we fought. After the presentation, Isabella approached me with nervous energy and determined eyes. "Miss Chen, I've been developing some theories about using artificial intelligence to predict gentrification patterns in emerging neighborhoods. My professors say it's too speculative for traditional real estate, but after hearing your story..." I smiled, remembering my own desperate attempts to share innovative ideas with investors who saw potential as a threat. "Isabella, speculative thinking is exactly what we need. Let's discuss it." Over the next hour, she outlined a strategy for using machine learning algorithms to analyze demographic data, infrastructure investments, and cultural indicators to predict neighborhood transformation 6 months before it became obvious to traditional investors. Her thinking was sophisticated, original, and exactly the kind of innovation that would define the next generation of real estate analysis. "Isabella, I'm offering you a position as our junior analyst and a $50,000 investment in your AI research. Your gentrification prediction model will be developed under your name and credited to you." 6 months later, Isabella's system was being licensed by investment firms across the country. She had become the youngest real estate analyst to address the National Association of Realtors convention. The story that began with a compass and a grandfather's faith in ownership had become something larger than either of us imagined. It became proof that when you refuse to accept limitations others place on you, you don't just change your own wealth, you create new possibilities for everyone who follows. Every time a young woman receives investment capital based on her ideas, every time innovation is credited to its actual creator, Every time the system chooses competence over connections, Grandpa Hank's notebook continues pointing toward true wealth. That direction is always toward ownership. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.